Hi everybody, it's me, Miss Mutu. So I wanted to make this video to welcome you to day 2 of Knowledge Virtual Learning. Today this lesson is all about the Arctic tundra. So we're going to talk about what is the Arctic habitat. So that's lesson 2. Yesterday, you guys were able to see my habitat. So today you are going to be continuing activity. So listen up. Here's lesson 2. So remember, students, you met Rattenborough yesterday in the previous lesson, and he will be showing us different habitats around the world. What are the 3 things that all habitats must have in order for living things to survive in? Take a second, think about it. What are those 3 major things? In order for living things to survive, they need food, water, and shelter. I repeat, in order for living things to survive, they need food, water, and shelter. So if you guessed those 3 things, you are correct. Now we're back to Rattenborough's habitat. I want us to take a second and observe, and I want us to describe Rattenborough's habitat. When you're looking at the image, I want you to think about things that you see that provide Rattenborough with food, water, and shelter. Take a second to think. Under the steps in an alleyway, that is Rattenborough's shelter. He gets his food from trash cans. He gets his water from drains and pipes. Now, describe your own habitat. Good job. Now that you described yours, I'm going to take a second to describe my habitat too. Here we are back in my habitat. Remember, Miss Mutu lives in Flatbush. So here's a cute little picture of Flatbush. I get my food from my local supermarket, which is Stop and Shop. I get my water from many places. Mostly I get my water that I drink from water bottles. But in my apartment, I get water from the sink. I also get water from pipes. And in my shower, I get water from the shower. Here is a picture of my shelter. I live in an apartment. Touch your nose if you also live in an apartment. Good. Now that I've shared about my habitat and you've also shared about yours, we're going to take an adventure today to a different habitat. But before we can learn about that habitat, we must first figure out where that habitat is on the map. So today we're going to learn about a place called the Arctic. Say it with me, Arctic. Here, I'm going to point to the Arctic on our map. Well, Miss Mutu can't really point to the Arctic from here. I'm going to need your help to point to the Arctic on the map. I want you to take out your fingers out. Good job. And I want you to point to where you think the Arctic is. If you pointed to the white part on the bottom, you are so close, but not quite. That's considered the South Pole. The Arctic is actually up top. Where the yellow lines are, that's considered the Arctic. The Arctic is a region around the North Pole, which is not part of a single continent. In this region, there are areas of land called the Arctic tundra and a large body of water known as the Arctic Ocean. Today, you will hear about plants and animals that live in the Arctic region, both on land and in water. As I'm reading, listen carefully to find out which animal and plants live in the Arctic tundra and in the Arctic Ocean and how they survive. What do you see in this image? Hello again, Rattenborough the adventurer here to take you on a tour of one of the coldest habitat on Earth, the Arctic tundra. In the tundra, there aren't very many plants. In fact, there are no trees at all. And A rat like me has to wear long johns or a warm layer of clothing under regular clothes and mittens. The wind here is incredibly strong, which makes it feel even colder. The ground is frozen and nearly everything is covered in ice. In the winter, daylight lasts only a few hours, and at times the sun does not come out at all. Some ice will still be here in the summer, but in the summer, the top layer of the ice melts so that the ground gets wet and muddy. The temperatures here are so low that most people and animals will freeze. All of these things make the Arctic tundra one of the least friendly habitats on Earth for plants and animals. Some plants and animals can only live in the Arctic tundra in the summer months when the temperature is warmer, but some are able to live all year long. Arctic plants go very close together and do not grow very tall, which keeps them from being blown away by the Arctic winds. The kinds of plants that can only live in the Arctic tundra are mosses and different types of grass. For once, I'm one of the tallest things around. The animals that call the Arctic tundra habitat home all year round have adapted to the harsh conditions. When an animal has adapted to a habitat, that means that it has changed over the years and now has special things that helps it live in that habitat. For example, many animals in the Arctic have adapted by growing heavy fur coats to help them stay warm in the cold temperatures. This creature is called a muskox. The muskox's long, shaggy coat has an extra layer of hair underneath that keeps him warm when the temperature is cold enough to turn a rat into a popsicle, and it sheds its extra coat of hair in the warmer summer months. What do you do to adapt when it's winter outside and it's cold? Muskoxen travel in herds so they can herdle together for added warmth. Muskoxen is the plural for muskox. Hooves, which are hard coverings on some animals' feet, are wide to keep them from slipping in the snow and ice. In the winter, muskoxen use their sharp hooves to dig under the snow to find plants to eat. Here comes an animal that I want to stay hidden from. This is a wolverine. Do you have any idea why Rattenborough wants to stay hidden from a wolverine? The wolverine uses its fur coat to keep nice and warm. Like the muskox, the wolverine has large paws to help it move across the snow and that come in handy when it's trying to catch food. Animals are called caribou and are part of the deer family. They are sometimes called reindeer. These caribou are traveling in a huge herd, which helps to protect them against attacks by other animals. Caribou's hair traps air, which keeps these animals warm. Hooves change depending on the time of year, so they can walk and run on mushy, wet terrain or on hard, icy terrain. Caribous also have antlers to help them dig for grass in the snow. What do you see in this picture? This Arctic fox also has a coat that changes during the winter from a brown summer coat into this very thick white fur to help the fox blend into its surroundings. The fur also covers its feet so it can walk on snow and ice. Thanks to the fox's fur, it can hide and sneak up on birds, hares, and rodents like me. The Arctic hare's white coat becomes much heavier in the winter. Its ears are smaller than those of other hares, meaning less of its body is exposed to the cold. When something is exposed, it is not protected and it is out in the open with nothing covering it. In the Arctic, any part of your body that is exposed can be cold. In other words, there is no place for critters with long, dangling ears. unless they have a long dangling earmuffs to keep those ears from freezing. The hair's white coloring also helps it hide in the snow, and its back feet are wide and large, like small snowshoes, so it can run fast in the snow. There are other kinds of habitats in the Arctic besides the tundra, and different kinds of animals and plants live in these other habitats. The Arctic Ocean is a habitat rich in sea life and animals that rely on the sea for their food. The water is so cold in the Arctic Ocean that most living creatures will be able to stay alive only a few minutes in it. Animals such as the walrus call the Arctic Ocean home. These huge creatures just love the icy water and can swim around for a long period of time. Walruses have adapted to life in the Arctic Ocean by storing blubber under their skin. Blubber is a layer of fat that some animals have under their skin that keeps them warm. Blubber prevents heat from escaping from their bodies. Walruses have long teeth called tusks, which they use almost like arms to pull themselves up out of the water onto the ice. Look at these cute animals. They are seals. Seals have blubber under their skin just like walruses. Some types of seals are born covered with a layer of white fur to keep them warm until they develop their blubber. Seals are incredible swimmers. Like fish and walruses, seals don't have arms and legs. Instead, seals have flippers, and they swim by wiggling their bodies from side to side, using their flippers to steer. They swim very fast, so they catch plenty of tasty fish. Thankfully, they don't eat rats. Here comes a polar bear. Look out! Let's hide beneath this rock, and I'll tell you all about this amazing creature. The polar bear is perhaps the best known of all animals living around the Arctic Ocean. This astonishing animal has adapted incredibly well to the harsh Arctic habitat. Polar bears are the largest bears in the world. Male polar bears weigh up to 1,700 pounds. That's probably heavier than everyone in your class put together, including your teacher. A polar bear grows up to 10 feet from head to toe. Yikes! Polar bears are covered with heavy coats made of 2 layers of fur, and they have a layer of blubber under their skin. Their ears and tails are very small so that not too much of their bodies are exposed to the cold weather. What does exposed mean again? It's a good thing they have all that fur and blubber and sharp claws because polar bears spend most of their life living in sea ice on chunks of ice that float in the Arctic Ocean. Sometimes polar bears take a dip in the icy Arctic waters to swim from one chunk of ice to another, and they have webbed paws, sort of like duck's feet, to help them swim. They use those mighty paws to hunt their favorite food, seals. Like all living things, polar bears need water to survive, and they get that water from melted snow and ice. Even though adult polar bears spend most of their time living on sea ice, polar bear babies or cubs are born on land. Their mothers, female polar bears, burrow in the snow to make a den. That means they dig a hole in the snow to make a shelter. They will then hide in the den while they have their babies. They stay in the den with their young all winter, and in the spring they finally come out. The cubs stay with their mom for almost 2 years to learn hunting and survival skills before leaving home. Now, speaking of home, I really must go home. It's absolutely frigid or very, very cold here, and my whiskers warmers are just not doing a good job. We have learned a lot about the Arctic habitat and the animals that have managed to adapt and survive here. I think our next stop should be somewhere warmer, don't you? Remember that even habitats as extremely cold as the Arctic tundra and Arctic Ocean can be full of life. Now, it's not easy for me to stay hidden in all this snow. I can barely move with all these clothes on, so I'm getting out of here before I get spotted by an Arctic fox. See you next time. The end. Hope you enjoyed the story. Now we're going to move into the comprehension question portion of this read aloud. So as we move into the comprehension portion, let's remember or remind your student that it's always really important to go back to the text to find specific evidence for the questions that they are asked. For example, number 1 says, describe the Arctic tundra habitat. So if your student gives you answers like, it's snowy, it's cold, you can ask them to tell you more. If you notice that they're having a hard time with this skill, you can prompt them to go back into the text. This may sound like this. I notice you gave a description, but I know we can add more. Let's see if we can go back to the text to find more detailed evidence. For that question, you'll go back to image 1. Here we are back at image 1. The reason that we went back to image 1 is because this part of the text states specific evidence related to our question. Our question is, let's go back and reread it again. Our question is, describe the Arctic tundra habitat. So I'm going to go back into the text and look for that specific part. The Arctic tundra. In the tundra, there aren't very many plants. In fact, there are no trees at all. And a rat like me has to wear long johns or warm layers of clothing under their clothes and mittens. The wind here is incredibly strong, which makes the air feel colder. The ground is frozen and nearly everything is covered in ice. In winter, daylight lasts only a few hours, and sometimes the sun doesn't come out at all. Ice is all over. Some ice will still be here in the summer. But in the summer, the top layer of ice melts so the ground gets wet and muddy. The temperatures here are so low that most people and animals will freeze. All of these things make the Arctic tundra one of the least friendly habitats on Earth for plants and animals. So at this point, I will ask my student the question, now that we have all the evidence, can you describe or add more detail? Then they'll be able to give you descriptive phrases or sentences from the text to get specific. So your scholar will be able to say something that sounds similar or close to this. The Arctic tundra is very cold and windy. The ground is frozen and covered with ice during the winter, when there is very little light. In the summer, the top layer melts and the ground gets wet and muddy. It has no trees, or it is treeless. Not a lot of plants and animals can survive in the Arctic tundra. So that's an example of what they can build on or say in addition to saying it's cold, it's icy. Push them to give you specific evidence from the text. They definitely can do it. Hope you enjoy. Thank you. Remember, always go back into the text. Next question. Describe the Arctic Ocean habitat. Again, one more time. Describe the Arctic Ocean habitat. Thank you so much for sharing your response with me. So now, in order for me or us to have more detail, we're going to go back into the text and reread a part of the text that talks specifically about the Arctic Ocean habitat. Here we go, back into the text to get that evidence. There are other kinds of habitats in the Arctic besides the tundra, and different kinds of plants and animals live in these other habitats. The Arctic Ocean is a habitat rich in sea life and animals that rely on the ocean for their food. The water is cold in the Arctic Ocean, and most living creatures would be able to stay alive only for a few minutes in it. This shows me that when I describe the Arctic Ocean habitat, it is very cold, too cold for many living creatures to live in for very long, and the Arctic Ocean is covered I mean covered in ice. Look at this picture. There's ice everywhere. Next question is all about plants. Here goes. What kinds of plants grow in the Arctic tundra? One more time. What type of plants grow in the Arctic tundra? Remember, if you're having a hard time remembering details from the story, you can always go back to the specific part that tells you. Thanks for sharing your answer. Now let's go back into the text to see if we can get any more details for your response. Here we are at the part of the text that talks specifically about plants in the Arctic tundra. Some plants and animals can only live in the Arctic tundra in the summer months when the temperature is warmer, but some are able to live there all year long. Arctic plants grow very close together and do not grow very tall, which keeps them from being blown away by the Arctic winds. The kinds of plants that can live in the Arctic tundra are mosses and different types of grass. How have walruses, seals, and polar bears adapt to keep warm? Again, how have walruses, seals, and polar bears adapt to keep warm? Take a second, respond to the question. We're going to go back to the text in a second. First stop is the walrus. Everybody wave to the walrus. All right, hands down, let's listen to see how they adapt. Walruses have adapted to life in the Arctic Ocean by storing blubber under their skin. Everybody touch your skin? All right, hands right back in your lap. Blubber is a layer of fat that some animals have under their skin that keeps them warm. Blubber prevents heat from escaping their bodies. Walruses also have long teeth called tusks, which they use almost like arms to pull themselves out of the water and onto the ice. So that's what we learned about walruses. Let's see what we can learn about seals. Seals have blubber under their skin just like walruses. Polar bears are covered with a heavy coat made up of 2 layers of fur, and they have a layer of blubber under their skin. So what's the word? We heard it again. They also have... Say it louder. They also have blubber. So seals, walruses, and polar bears have blubber. But I noticed something on top of a polar bear's skin that the other 2 animals didn't have. Give me 2 claps if you notice it. Yes, polar bears have fur. What do they have? They have, yes, fur. Why is it important for living creatures to adapt to the environment in which they live? So this question is not something that we can go back into the text for. We have to use everything that we've listened to in the text and that we know about how animals adapt in order to answer the question. So take a second, give your best response, and then I'll give you what I think. Here's an example of how humans have adapted to the Arctic. It is important for living creatures to adapt to an environment that they live in because they need to figure out ways for them to survive in the climate. They can survive by figuring out what they need to find food, water, and shelter. Humans in the Arctic have come up with different strategies in order to adapt to these harsh, cold climates, and they have survived. I want you to think about this question and share with somebody around you. Is the Arctic a good habitat for a polar bear? Why or why not? Take a second. Thanks for sharing. So yes, the Arctic is a good habitat for a polar bear because the polar bear can find food, which is seals, water, which is melted snow and ice, and shelter in dens. So yes, it's a great habitat for a polar bear. In the read aloud, you heard that the animals that call the Arctic tundra habitat home all year round have adapted to the harsh conditions. The word is adapted. Say it with me. Adapted. One more time. Adapted. Adapted means to change over time or to be better prepared for or better able to do something. The animals in the harsh Arctic habitat have adapted to very cold weather. What word are we talking about again? Yes, the word is adapted. Now let's play a little game. I will show you images of certain animals you heard about today. Your job is to tell me some ways each animal has adapted to the Arctic habitat. Be sure to use the word adapted in your answer. For example, you'll say, this animal adapted by, and then you state the things that they have used to prepare themselves to adapt or change to survive. Get ready, the first animal is coming up. Drum roll, please. How has the Arctic hare adapted to the Arctic? Feel free to pause the video, go back into the text of the part that talks about the Arctic hare, and use the word adapted in your response. One example is the Arctic hare has adapted because its white fur blends in with the snow. Here's the next animal, caribou. How have these herd of caribou adapted to the Arctic? Pause the video, go back in the story to the section that talks about caribou. Now I'm going to share my response with you after you've already shared yours. So, the caribou have adapted by traveling in large herds to stay warm. Here's what's called a characteristic chart. So every time we learn about a new habitat, we'll jump in to describe different characteristics. The first one is climate. Climate is a type of weather a place has over a long period of time. So that's box number 1. Next one is water. Water is sources of water in that habitat. So what type of water or where can you find water? The next one is ground. The type of land or what is on the ground in that habitat. Meaning, what do you see? How can you describe it? Next are plants. Types of plants in the habitat. What plants are in the habitat and what do they look like? The last one is adaptations or characteristics of plants or animals that allow them to live in the habitat. Now let's jump in and fill out this chart for our habitat, the Arctic. Climate. The Arctic is both cold and windy. Water. Some water in springs and summer from melted ice for drinking. Lots of salt water in the ocean that animals can't drink. The next category is ground. In the winter, the ice is frozen ground. In the summer, wet and muddy ground with some ice. The ocean has chunks of floating ice in salt water. Plants are moss and grass on the tundra. Animals are known as muskoxen, wolverines, caribou, Arctic fox, Arctic hares, walruses, seals, and polar bears. And the adaptations for these animals are heavy fur, the color of their fur, which is often white to camouflage or blend in, and unique feet characteristics. In this picture, you see hooves. Now it's time to do your exit ticket or your activity. This is the activity that you will be handing into your teacher. You or your parent will take a picture of it and upload it to Class Dojo. So here is the Knowledge 8 Animals and Habitat book. Turn to page 2, Arctic Habitat. The question for today is, rate at least 2 things you learned about the Arctic habitat. Here is my example. So I drew a bunch of little animals in the Arctic habitat. There's polar bears, penguins. I drew some mountains, some ice, and I did some labels. Here's what I wrote. Today I learned many things about the Arctic. I learned that the climate is very cold and windy. I learned that plants grow very low on the ground and close together. I also learned that animals have fur and blubber to stay warm. The end. You can always go back to the chart, replay the video to get facts that you need for your writing. Good luck. So you did it. Good job. This is the end of the video. All you have to do now is take out your habitat journal, Write about 2 things you've learned about the Arctic tundra and submit it on Class Dojo to your teacher. Bye. See you soon.